Hello there, Pokemon fans, and welcome to our How to Best Use series, and this is going to be our Bulbasaur edition. So for those of you that aren't familiar with this series, we're going to go through each of the Generation 1 starter Pokemon and map out how they can best be used in the games just to play to each Pokemon's strengths. Now you might have seen a lot of best lists that say how to use a certain Pokemon or which Pokemon would work best in a team to conquer each region. That's not really what this list is going to be about. This list will be a little bit different. Basically, we're just going to go through each Pokemon and say what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and in a vacuum, what is the best way to use this Pokemon. Now, since these are the Generation 1 Pokemon we're going to go through, we're going to focus on Generations 1, 2, and 3. And for Generation 3, specifically the remakes of Red and Blue with the Fire Red and Leaf Green versions. So without any further ado, let's move on. So the first Pokemon we're going to deal with is Bulbasaur, number 1 in the Pokédex, and Bulbasaur's evolutions, Ivysaur and Venusaur. This Pokemon can of course be got at the start of the games in Red and Blue. You can't really get them in Generation 2 unless you trade them in, and again in the remakes at the start of the game in Fire Red and Leaf Green. Yellow's a little bit different. You can get Bulbasaur a little bit later on. But let's take a look at Bulbasaur itself and Bulbasaur's different evolutions. And then specifically, we're going to take a look at Venusaur here. And the reason for that is really, there's not much reason to keep a Bulbasaur and an Ivysaur long. You pretty much want to just get it along to Venusaur as quick as you can. And so when we're taking a look at these stats, you can see overall, like many of the starters, Venusaur is really well-rounded. In particular, Venusaur has great special attack and great defense, but across the board, we're pretty solid. You know, we have okay speed. It's nothing great, but it's not too bad. Okay attack, okay defense, and our hit points are pretty solid too. So there's not a whole lot of weaknesses really in Bulbasaur's game. With that said, Bulbasaur is really not one, or Venusaur I should say, is really not one that has some big overwhelming strength either. So if we take a look at the moves that Venusaur can learn, in Generation 1 you're pretty limited. There really just is not that much in Gen 1 for Pokemon to learn move-wise. What I would say is, in terms of their moves, starting out with something like Vine Whip and eventually upgrading to something like Razor Leaf is a good idea. You can always add in Solar Beam if you want to hit really hard. Just be aware that in Gen 1, you're going to have to be waiting for a turn to really pull that off. And I would say adding something like Sleep Powder into the mix just for extra coverage and just to really help in some kind of tricky situations would be useful. In terms of getting them some TMs, there's a bunch of different ways you can go. I personally like Body Slam, being that it's a pretty strong attack there that can do a lot of damage. Being that it's normal type, it just provides a good, solid hit in many cases. Using an HM Slave is always good, but you can always use something like Cut as well to try to get through some earlier parts of the game. Mega Drain as well, just to kind of suck some health from your opponent and replenish your strength. Not a bad idea overall. Again, in Generation 1, really your move pool is fairly limited. Now in Gen 2, things start to get a little more interesting, but again, we're a little bit limited here and there. Again, starting out with Vine Whip and replacing it with something like Razor Leaf is generally a pretty good idea. I still like the idea of throwing Sleep Powder into the mix just to help with some coverage. Solar Beam, again, it's a good move that's going to hit pretty hard. You just have to be a little bit cautious because, again, it is going to be that 2-turn attack. Now what you can do, starting in Gen 2, is couple it with something like Sunny Day, and then not have to worry about the 2-turn attack thing, which is kind of nice. And Giga Drain is really just a better version of Mega Drain that's going to really help you out in terms of getting some health back. Other than that, in terms of some TMs, maybe you want to give it something like Hyper Beam just to let it hit really hard. Something like Toxic can be used as well. Headbutt is a solid normal attack, which again is kind of like Body Slam in Gen 1, where it just kind of allows you to hit a bunch of teams without really many different weaknesses. And then in Gen 3, again, we have a few differences here, that kind of allow us to do pretty well here. Vine Whip again is a good a good starting attack that should be upgraded to Razor Leaf. Sleep Powder is still pretty useful. Solar Beam, again, if you want to hit pretty hard, is good. Giga Drain and Solar Beam, again, pretty useful in the TM side if you want to use the TM on Solar Beam rather than level all the way up to 65. Now in this gen, using something like Sludge Bomb is not a bad idea. Being that Venusaur is half poison, it does help you a fair bit. But in general, poison is really not that good of an offensive type, and being that it is attack in here, rather than a special attack, it really does not take advantage of Venusaur's strengths all that well. I frankly think you're still better off going with some solid normal attack of your choosing. Strength, if you want to use an HM on Venusaur, is not a bad choice. Return is always a solid choice as well. So in general, again, just to kind of wrap things up for Venusaur here, and Bulbasaur and Ivysaur, you want to kind of focus in on moves that are going to take advantage of the special attack. And I like to throw a few things in the mix as well, things like Sleep Powder, just to give you that extra coverage. In general, for Venusaur, it's pretty tough to take advantage of our poison half, so sticking to grass moves is probably your best bet. And then really even sticking to something like normal moves there that'll just allow you to hit at a pretty broad spectrum is generally a pretty good idea, and generally the way I would recommend going. So that'll do it for our Venusaur edition for Bulbasaur and Ivysaur and Venusaur. Stay tuned. The next one we're going to do is our Squirtle edition, which will go through Squirtle, Wordle, and Blastoise there, just the same way we did for Venusaur. So if you liked our video here, make sure you like it and share it, and tune in for our next one. Have a good one, guys.